Jerusalem, the Contested City. Lecture 9. The Crusades.
At the end of the last lecture, the Muslims were in firm control of Jerusalem, and they were exercising sovereignty over the city, which was still, in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, made up with majority population of Christians, with a small group of Jews resident there and the Muslim rulers of the city. And we don't know a great deal about it, about the city. It has very low profile during this era. One thing we do know is that there was a kind of Western presence, Western Christian presence in the city. As I've already mentioned, there were Western pilgrims who had started at the age of Constantine, the 4th century, and continued right through the presence of the Muslims there. So there were Western pilgrims passing through the city, but there was a little more to it than that. There were also probably Western monks who were resident in the city, perhaps, and even some Western merchants, maybe from Amalfi. Some of the Italian commercial cities were showing a commercial interest in Palestine generally, and perhaps Jerusalem more specifically. And then there is this business of Charlemagne. Charlemagne is the Holy Roman Emperor, the Frankish king who promoted himself to the position of emperor, crowned by the Pope. It's not that side that at first catches our attention. It's who he's connected with. The ruler, his contemporary ruler in the Middle East, the Caliph of Islam, which is no longer part of the Umayyad dynasty in Damascus, but a new dynasty called the Abbasids, who are ruling from Baghdad, from distant Baghdad. One of these rulers, perhaps the most famous of all of them because he features in the Arabian Nights, is the ruler called Harun al-Rashid, notorious or famous for his generosity and his humanity in this famous work. And according to the story, and it is no more than a story, there was some kind of diplomatic relations between these two great men of the 8th century, Harun al-Rashid in Baghdad and Charlemagne in Aachen, and that they had conducted some sort of diplomatic correspondence, and that Charlemagne had received from Harun al-Rashid the keys to the Holy Sepulchre as some sort of sign or signal of a protectorate that Charlemagne was granted over this Christian holy place. That Charlemagne, as the leading Christian emperor, which would have been news to the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople at the time, was given this token of esteem by Harun al-Rashid, and that the story even goes on to say, according to some versions of it, that Charlemagne had actually visited Jerusalem, about which we can be pretty sure did not happen. It's not mentioned in any of the lives of Charlemagne. But the fact that there was a Western presence in Jerusalem, at least from the 8th century, and continuing on thereafter, seems relatively certain. Now, there is also another dynastic change that takes place in Jerusalem. That in the late 960s, there was a new power that arose in North Africa and the Western Islamic world. These people are called the Fatimids, and they're called such because Fatima was the favorite daughter of Muhammad, and she married Muhammad's cousin, Ali. And there was a group of Muslims, a substantial group of Muslims, who are called the Party of Ali, or in Arabic, Shi'at Ali, and in English, Shiites, whose position it was that the rulership of the Islamic community was, first of all, was a spiritual rulership, not a political rulership like the caliphs, right, which was essentially a political institution in their eyes. And that secondly, that this spiritual leadership of the community belonged by predisposed right, by God's decree, by Muhammad's announcements, etc., to Ali and his family and their descendants. So the descendants of the marriage of Ali and Fatima, hence the title of these Shiites, as they're called, of Fatimids. Well, the Fatimids had suddenly appeared in North Africa and had taken over what is today Tunisia, and had proceeded both east and west from there, east until they reached Egypt, where they established themselves. It's they, for example, who built built the city of Cairo. And in 970, they built the city of Cairo in 969. 970, they arrived in Palestine. Where they were headed was toward Baghdad. Their mission was to unseat the Sunni caliphs of Baghdad. Sunni means people of consensus and people of the community. This is the majority party of Muslims, the Sunnis. Today, for example, the Muslim world has about 80% are Sunnis and 20%, most of them in Iran, are Shiites. But in the 10th century, Shiism was a rising threat in the Islamic world, and at this point, the Shiites had taken over, the Fatimid Shiites had taken over Palestine. Now, they had no substantial effect on the city. They really weren't there long enough. But what did happen was that the Islamic rule of Palestine as a whole began to lapse into a kind of anarchy. That the government control, government apparatus, offices, military control began to slip out of the hands of these Fatimids. And as a result, the countryside began to be dominated by Bedouin and by roaming bands of intruders. And that the chief beneficiaries of this kind of state of anarchy that had set in was the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire was the Eastern Christian Empire, which we recall was pushed out of Jerusalem in 635, and by 640 was pushed out of all of Palestine and all of Syria. And the frontier between the Eastern Christian world, this Byzantine Empire, and the Islamic world was pretty much at what is today the frontier between Turkey and Syria. The Muslims, the Arab Muslims, had never managed to get up on the Anatolian plateau. One theory is that the camels, who were the chief vehicle of this army, this was a camel-mounted army of the Muslims, could not survive in the winters of the high Anatolian plateau, and that therefore the conquest came up against the foot of the Taurus Mountains, and it stopped there. Well, in the 10th century, in 972 to be precise, the Byzantines were strong enough now, and the Muslims in control of Palestine were weak enough now that the Byzantines began to mount a counteroffensive and begin to push southward into northern Syria and toward Palestine. And the interesting thing about this is that it is clearly a kind of holy war, that the announced intention of the Byzantine emperors, as they tried to recruit other Christian powers like the Armenians to assist them, was to regain the holy places from the infidels, from these Muslim infidels. And they got pretty close. The Byzantine armies, proceeding southward, got as far as Damascus and actually had penetrated into Galilee before they had reached the point where they could proceed no further and began gradually to withdraw. It was a strong and sort of one powerful counterpunch, but they were unable to sustain this, and so this was perhaps a sign or a symbol of what was going to happen in the future, but it was no more than that for the present. But the emphasis shifts back to the Fatimids. The Fatimid capital was Cairo in Egypt, and that's where the ruler lived. And the ruler in the beginning of the 11th century was a man by the name of al-Hakim. And al-Hakim was an eccentric ruler at best, and perhaps a little bit mad as well. And al-Hakim took it into his mind that he would begin to enforce the Sharia in all its severity in Egypt, and that he ended up actually in pronouncing himself as God, as the incarnation of God, and forced his subjects to worship him. Part of this madness that was going on the part of al-Hakim was surely his thought that he should destroy the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He had heard, as the story goes, he had heard about a famous miracle that used to take place there. I suppose from the Muslim point of view, there is nothing more annoying than somebody else's miracles, particularly when it is repeated on a yearly schedule, that every year on Holy Saturday, what the Christians called Holy Saturday, the day before Easter, all the lights in the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Constantine's great basilica and domed church, were extinguished. And then suddenly, right, a light would appear in the dome above the Holy Sepulchre, the open dome, and light would have come from the outside, and there would emerge from inside the Holy Sepulchre the Bishop of Jerusalem, or the Patriarch as he was called, carrying a lighted taper in his hands, miraculously ignited from that other light, and all the other candles and tapers in the church would be lit from his, and the lights would gradually spread out over Jerusalem. This miracle, as I say, was repeated on an annual basis. A miracle that was repeated as one of the spectacles of Jerusalem from very early on. We don't know exactly the beginning of this thing, perhaps as early as the 5th or 6th century, before the Muslims arrived, when all through the Muslim period, down into the 19th century, when skepticism had reached a high point, and B, there was a disaster, a hysterical disaster inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. People were trampled to death, other people were burned to death, as a combination of panic and fire took over. And it marked, for all practical purposes, the end of this miraculous apparition. But to get back to Al-Hakam had heard about this and was annoyed by it. Perhaps a more psychologically oriented interpreter might think that the fact that Al-Hakam's mother was a Christian might have something to do with this. Many of these caliphs, by the way, either married or had as their concubines foreign women who were not Muslims, many of them, women who from other parts who were certainly not Arabs. There were constant new blood being injected in the system through these marriages. But anyway, Al-Hakam's mother was a Christian, so perhaps burning down the most famous church in Christianity was sending a message to Mom. But anyway, he gave the orders to the governor of Jerusalem, who complied and burned Constantine's church down, almost to the ground. And when news of this, of course, reached Europe, there was outrage and disbelief even that such a thing had happened. Eventually, the church was rebuilt. This occurred, by the way, in the year 1009. That's when the church was burned down. By 1048, the church had been rebuilt, and the money had come from, just as it came later on from another Christian emperor to rebuild the walls of the city, had come from a Christian emperor in Constantinople. This was by invitation and asking for outside help, and in return, and this was a dangerous precedent that had begun, the Christian emperor in Byzantium was given a kind of protectorate. It's the echo of the thing that we heard about Charlemagne, that some Christian outsider is given a protectorate over the Christians, in this case, of Jerusalem. And it's a process that will be repeated again and again. In the 16th century, the French will be given a kind of protectorate. In the 19th century, every European power is claiming some sort of protected rights over the minorities of Jerusalem. But here it is happening in a clear-cut fashion. The Christian quarter, the northwest quadrant of the city, is now given a kind of autonomous status within the city under the direction of the Greek patriarch, the Greek bishop of the city. So this is the situation toward the end of that century, toward the end of the 1000s. And it's at this point that we hear for the first time of this European phenomenon called the Crusade. There were a great many crusades. They went on for a very long time, striking at all sorts of targets of opportunity inside the Islamic world, and sometimes not within the Islamic world. There was one notorious crusade directed against Constantinople, a Christian city, the Fourth Crusade. But the crusade that concerns us here is the First Crusade, the one that was directed specifically against Jerusalem, had as its intention of winning Jerusalem and Palestine back from their Muslim sovereigns. And so we must take a look at this sort of phenomenon. A crusade is a military expedition, right? And it's a military expedition taken for the precise purpose of taking back the Holy Land from the infidels in question being the Muslims. And it is not undertaken by the church. The church doesn't have any army, and so it can't mount a crusade. But the crusade is nonetheless under the patronage and under the encouragement of the Latin Church, which attempts then to persuade its subjects, the knights, the aristocracy, the kings of Western Christendom, to take up the cross and to fulfill this pious purpose. So they're asked to volunteer for this, and the church grants a number of inducements for this, spiritual inducements and economic inducements. It is, as it is called, a pilgrimage in arms. But the more common term, of course, is crusade. And crusade comes from a variety of Romance languages, which all go back, in a sense, to the word for cross. Because when a crusader, when a knight, prince, king, took the vow that he would go on crusade, he attached to some part of his clothing, to his outer tunic perhaps, a cross as a symbol that he had taken this vow. Now, this is a vow. This is not just a kind of piece of paper. It's a serious spiritual promise. And in the 11th century, these things were taken extremely seriously. So under vow to go to the Holy Land, and he would take then his own troops, which he was responsible for the support of these people and to equip and provision them. These were the foot soldiers, his yeomen, and he and his knights, all mounted troops, that's what knight means, would then go off on the crusade, go to the Holy Land under the direction of whoever was the ranking sovereign. And the inducements were twofold. One was indulgences, that is a kind of spiritual reward, a remission of the temporal punishment, the time that would have to be spent in working off the penalty for sins in the afterlife, if people went on the crusade. So these indulgences were part of the spiritual rewards that were induced. In more modern times, we might say that also that if you died on the crusade, if you died in this Christian jihad, you would go directly to paradise. So the notion of the martyrs of the Lord finding themselves in paradise is not exactly a new notion. The economic inducements were that you were allowed to divert part of the church's income in your country, if you were the king or the prince or the count, to the underwriting of this enterprise, so that the church was helping to support this by allowing you to take some of its stipulated income that it would have gotten from its lands to support the crusade. And so in the year 1095, at a council that was being held at Clermont in France, southern France, Pope Urban II formally announced a crusade. And in a long sermon, which is reported to us by a number of different people who were present, tried to stir up the assembled body of Christians by recounting the atrocities that had taken place in the Holy Land and trying to encourage people to take up the cross and to go off on this crusade. It should be noted, sort of in passing, that there was no call on the part of the local Christians in Jerusalem that somebody should come to their aid. This was something that was provoked in the West of its own. There may have been a call from the Byzantine emperor to come and help win his lands back, but certainly not a call from any of the Eastern Christians that these people should come. So the crusade took place and was announced in 1095, and in 1099, after a number of adventures, as you can imagine, the logistics of this were considerable, of transporting all of these people there. But in 1099, the Crusaders stood before the walls of Jerusalem. Most of the knights who had responded, most of the volunteers for this crusade, were French. And there were some English and some Germans as well, but the great bulk of them were French, and that the word Frank, in Arabic frangi, continues to this day to be one of the Arabic terms for a foreigner. It's a hangover from this Crusades, actually. A number of people have left eyewitness accounts of this attack on Jerusalem and the siege and the deeds of chivalry that were performed on this occasion. Jerusalem was walled. It had been walled by first by the Maccabees and by Herod, have been rebuilt at various times, and it had been rebuilt the walls had been restored by the Muslims, and just as recently as the 1040s, the walls had been redone. The walls of Jerusalem had been redone. So this was a siege situation, that the Crusaders had to besiege Jerusalem with the usual siege machinery, which they used, and had to breach the walls and to get in that way, and which they did. They breached the walls, they broke into the city, and what followed was purely and simply a bloodbath. The Eastern Christians most of them had cleared out of the city. They knew what was coming. The Jews had been warned beforehand, probably by some of their compatriots in Europe, where the Crusades had set up all sorts of difficult situations for the Jews of Europe at their outset, because the Crusades had whipped up a great deal of religious fanaticism, and so that the Jews were sort of practiced punching bags almost for the Crusaders on their way to Jerusalem. But to get back to Jerusalem itself, there were no Jews left in the city, appreciable numbers anyway, and the Eastern Christians had cleared out, and so it was essentially the Muslim population that was there, and they held out as best they could in two places. One, the two most fortified places, I suppose, the citadel at the western, or the Jaffa Gate, as it's called today, the old Herodian citadel there, and on the Temple Mount, just as the Jewish defenders of Jerusalem against the Romans in 70 had held out on the Temple Mount, so these Muslim defenders of the city held out there too to the end. And the last place they were was in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and we have descriptions of them being thrown from the roof of it down to their death, or either that or committing suicide. And then finally it was over, and everybody had been killed, all the defenders had been killed, and there are extraordinary accounts of these Crusaders on July 15th of 1099, when it was over, walking days through the streets of Jerusalem, the empty streets of Jerusalem, looking at themselves covered with blood. They were like butchers, somebody said, drenched with the blood of themselves, their compatriots, and the Muslims as they went through the city. So the city was empty, and the Crusaders had succeeded. They had driven the Muslims out. They now owned Jerusalem, and so it was a question of taking possession of the city. Easier said than done. The city was empty of its population, which was not a terribly good idea as a matter of survival. And so one of the things that had to be done is that the city had to be repopulated and then rebuilt. The taking over the city, this crusade was mounted in the name of the church. Right? It was the church's idea. We don't know exactly what the church may have expected from the consequences of this. Did the church expect that the city, at least the city, and perhaps maybe Palestine itself, would be handed over to the church, that it would become a papal state, as existed many places in Italy? There were papal states, where the Pope in Rome was the sovereign of these places. They expect that. That did not happen. The Byzantines certainly expected the Crusaders, talk about wishful thinking, that these Crusaders would just hand over this land back to their original owners, the Eastern Roman Empire, emperor in Constantinople. This did not happen either. What the Crusaders did was simply to take the city for themselves. That is to say, the city and the land, that the entire Holy Land, whatever the Crusaders at this stage held, was converted into a kingdom on the model of a European kingdom. And so there would be a king, and then various other places in the kingdom would be held by princes, like Antioch. The city of Antioch belonged to a prince, and the town of Edessa was in the possession of a count, and other places around the countryside, castles in various places which were held by these Latin Christians, became part of the patrimony of this Latin kingdom. But the first thing is the city itself, that Jerusalem had to be sort of reconstituted as a city. And as I say, it was empty. So the first thing was one thing that was attempted to do was to try to entice back into the city as many of these Eastern Christians as was possible, people who had gone out into the countryside, who probably felt it was safer living under Muslims, as they had for many centuries now, than living under these strange, frangi people from Europe, people who were not particularly sympathetic to them, because these Franks, these Crusaders, these European Crusaders, Catholics, found the Eastern Christians at best exotic, because they spoke Arabic, they ate the Middle Eastern food, they dressed like their Muslim fellow countrymen, and they were almost indistinguishable from them. And they were Christians, but their Christianity was of a type that had been judged by the Western Church already as heretical. So there was a kind of cultural disconnect here between them and their fellow Christians of the East. Orthodox Greeks, Syrians, all of these people were unspeakably exotic and a little bit off-putting to the Crusaders, but they needed them back in the city, right? Because the city has to have a functioning population if it's going to defend itself or even survive as a entity. So they tried to get them back, and they tried also to recruit people from Europe to try to get immigration. See, when the crusade was over, many of the Crusaders simply went home. They were worried about what was going on with their eldest son back home, or their brother, the one they left behind, or their wife that they left behind. All of this stuff was, years in the past now, and they were concerned, as you might expect. And so a number of people, having attained the goal of this crusade, went home, leaving a smaller group in Jerusalem as the citizens, the subjects of this new Latin kingdom. So they tried, by painting enthusiastic pictures or optimistic pictures, of trying to encourage immigration, right, into the new kingdom, not terribly successfully. This kingdom lasted less than 100 years, and it was the Muslims, as we shall see, who put an end to it, but it may have been demographics that put an end to it. The population may not simply have not been enough to sustain that city and that kingdom. At any rate, they began to remake the city. The Crusaders began to remake the city and to make over some things and to build new things. The most famous, I guess, makeovers that took place in the city was the primary Muslim holy place, the Dome of the Rock. What the Crusaders did was, first of all, they converted it into a church, and they installed a regular clergy to do services there, and the clergy lived nearby, up on the Temple Mount, in small apartments. The way they converted into a church is they covered the rock with marble and put on top of the marble, right under the dome, an altar. So this became the church of they called it the Templum Domini, or the Temple of the Lord. And the Aqsa Mosque at the end of the temple of the Haram Sharif, which they called the Templum Solomonis, or the Temple of Solomon. They thought that this was they probably thought this was Solomon's palace, that they thought the Dome of the Rock was the original Solomon's temple, and that the other thing was the Aqsa Mosque was the site of Solomon's palace. But what they did was they converted that Aqsa Mosque into the palace of the Latin king of Jerusalem. That was the first royal residence of these kings, Godfrey of Bouillon, who was the first of them, but not for very long, because it turned out not to be terribly practical. The king moved over to the Western Gate, which was always somehow the rulers of Jerusalem preferred to live over there rather than to live up on the Temple Mount. What happened to the Aqsa Mosque is that it became the headquarters of a new group that had been created as part of the Crusades, a group of knights who took the vows of monks. They became monk-knights. It's a monastic military order who were aristocrats, military men, and who took vows of celibacy and poverty and obedience to their superior, and whose function it was to defend the Holy Land against the Muslims. And these became the shock troops, the elite troops of the Latin kingdom. They and another military order called the Hospitallers, whose headquarters were near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in a place called the Hospital. That's why they got their name. So these two orders of military monks were the mainstay of the military forces of the new kingdom. And their headquarters, as I say, was the Aqsa Mosque on the southern end of Herod's platform. The kingdom, as I say, comprised all of the Crusader holdings in the area. It extended up into what is today Turkey and down close to the southern end of the Dead Sea. There were some castles on the eastern side of the Dead Sea in what is today Jordan, that the town of Kerak had a famous Crusader castle. These Crusader castles were all over the landscape, and they were really sort of enclaves where the Crusaders lived in very close quarters and tried to patrol the countryside. But they were locked in, they were imprisoned, in effect, into these places. And as for the church, its sole possession out of this was this Christian quarter of Jerusalem, the northwest quadrant, which was now put under the control of the Latin bishop of Jerusalem. Because one of the things that happened was, in the transformation of this city into a Latin city, that all the local clergy, all the eastern clergy, were cleared out. All the Greeks and Syrians who controlled their churches were cleared out, and to a large extent, Latin Christian clergy were put in their place. So the Latins now control the city, including the bishop of the city, the patriarch. A patriarch is the archbishop or the chief bishop of a very important place. That there's a patriarch in Constantinople, in Alexandria, in Antioch, and in Jerusalem. So the chief bishop of Jerusalem has always been called the patriarch. So there was now a Latin patriarch. There's a Latin king and a Latin patriarch. There is ecclesiastical property, and there is the feudal property of the king. And there is a population trying desperately to stay alive in these rather hostile circumstances. And so the Crusades, in a sense, were successful. The Jerusalem had been won, and a certain foothold had been gained in the Holy Land. As we shall see, its life was a short one. It starts in the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099, and they are thrown out. They are rather disastrously dislodged from Jerusalem in 1187. And that's the extent of the holding on to the city. It left its stamp. The Crusaders had altered, for example, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They made the Holy Sepulchre church now about only a third of the size of Constantine's church. They made it look like a Western church. They built a belfry or bell tower next to the entry. They redid the entry in Western style. They tried to give it the look of a slight Western cathedral.
After listening to Lecture 9, a student posed this question to Professor Peters. Did the Muslims realize the extent of the crusade that had been launched against them? Let's listen to the professor's response.
One of the apparently curious things about this is that the Muslims seem to have no idea that this attack upon the city of Jerusalem, the landing of the Crusaders, the approach of the Crusaders, was part of a crusade, a holy war. There was hardly any Muslim intelligence about Europe. The Europeans, the Western Christians, the Latins, knew a good deal about the Middle East. They knew it from their history, and they knew it from reports of pilgrims who were constantly going to Jerusalem and returning and writing up their memoirs. So there was in circulation in Europe a good deal of information about the Middle East, about Palestine more generally, and Jerusalem specifically. The Muslims, for their part, knew very, very little about the politics or the religion or the movements that were going on in Europe. They were unconcerned, for example, that the Muslims of Spain were locked in a kind of fatal struggle to hold on to that part of the Muslim conquest. They knew nothing about the politics of the Papal States or the papacy. So the Crusades came as a kind of surprise to the Muslims, and that, as has been pointed out for a very long time, there wasn't even an Arabic word to describe crusade.
This ends Lecture 9.